I was sitting in a church service one day, sitting up towards the back, and suddenly the number 3 came to me and the word back pain. And I remember thinking to myself, I think I've got a word of knowledge. And while I was sitting there wondering what to do with it, the preacher who was on the stage suddenly said, "Somebody here has a word of knowledge. Who is that?" Well, I just about jumped up from my seat and I said, "I think it's me." I said, "I'm getting the number 3 and back pain." And he said, "Well, when you said back pain, I noticed you put your hand on your lower back." So the preacher asked the congregation, "Anyone with lower back pain, put your hand up." Well, 3 people put their hands up. So then he said to those 3 people, "Well, I want you to go back to where John is sitting at the back and he'll pray for you for healing." The preacher didn't pray for them himself. He'd been teaching that God can use anybody to heal the sick, and God can use anybody to move in the gifts of the Spirit. So he wanted to give an example of that. So he got me to pray for these people instead of praying himself. I wasn't a pastor or anything like that at the time. I was just a regular member of the congregation, but God gave me this word of knowledge. So anyway, 3 people came back to where I was sitting, and I laid hands on each of them for healing. When I came to the last of the 3 people, he told me that he was born with an unformed disc in his spine. So I asked him, "Which disc is it?" He said he was born with the number 3 disc from the bottom wasn't formed properly. So I laid hands on him and prayed for him. A couple of years later, God called me to go into a travelling ministry, and I was in a country town and I met one of the men who I'd prayed for about his back. He said, "Do you remember praying for my back?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'd had that back pain for many years," and he said, "It's been real good ever since you prayed for me." Then he said, "Do you remember praying for my friend who was born with an unformed disc in his spine?" I said, "Yeah, I sure do." He said, "Well, that man was a friend of mine, and it was the first time he'd ever been in a church like that." So he said that how God spoke to me about his back problem and the number 3 was a real sign to him and made a real impression on him. So God gave me that word of knowledge. I wasn't a pastor at the time, just a regular member of the church, and the visiting preacher that day had been teaching that God can use any believer to lay hands on the sick. He can use any believer to move in the gifts of the Spirit. So if the Holy Spirit chose to give me a word of knowledge that day, the Holy Spirit will give you his gifts as well. So just believe and ask that the Holy Spirit will start to use you in his gifts to help you to encourage other believers and to win the lost.